Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you are. Oh, I got this in the wrong order, didn't I? And welcome to Free Thought Hour. Now, Free Thought Hour, as you know, is a son of an earlier show that I did. It's let me tell you a bit about myself, because my guest hasn't turned up yet. I'm a retired science teacher who can't stop. It's my mission to further the public understanding of science. So how many years ago was it now? 7, 8? I started a Skeptics in the Pub chapter. That was in our local town of Worthing. And we held meetings every month. We had a guest speaker, and then we had Q&A, and we had some very nice speakers come to us. And we held meetings in a pub, various pubs. The last one we used was opposite the railway station, which made it very easy for our guests to travel. And it had a hotel above, so they could stay overnight if they required that facility. So I've organized in that time something like 70, maybe more, different events. And then, of course, last year, along came COVID. So the whole thing got stomped upon, and that's when I had to learn how to make videos, edit videos, do live streaming, and here we are. I see my guest has turned up. So that's enough about me. What we want to hear about is him. It's RJ Downard. Hello, RJ. How the devil are you?
Oh, I am alive here in Spokane, and hopefully our StreamYard connection will hold.
Yeah. Well, we've had some dodgy connections when we've been chatting, haven't we? And some weeks ago, the telecom cabinet across the road, which normally gives me a storming connection, blew a fuse. I ended up hotspotting it to my mobile. But fortunately,
Basically, the rule I go by is you wing it and you do your best, and that's it.
Yeah, that's it. Thank you for turning up anyway. I was hoping that I wasn't going to have to busk a whole hour on my own.
I know. Well, it's just about the thing. I was just getting prepped, and okay, I'm putting my shirt on and all that kind of. 12:30.
I can see you've been through makeup.
No, nothing improves this.
So tell the people about you. You're in Spokane, which is spelt Spokane but pronounced Spokane.
Yeah.
We're used to that because we have a lot of names that we deliberately mispronounce just to fox the foreigners.
Oh yeah. Borehamwoodshire. No, it's Broome. Rough.
Exactly. Yeah. I loved it when one time we went to Connecticut when they have a town called Norwich, which of course is a steal from East Anglia here, only it's pronounced, correctly pronounced, Norwich.
Yeah. Well, in part because words of English and French spell things differently, just as German and French do. So the uses of EIs and all that are altered, and the lexicography thing of what GHs and things did in the way things got spelled. And then all of that gets mushed up as people settle in new areas, pick up the word, transform the meaning of it, and you get used to it.
Yeah, there you go. You see, our audience, I told you he's a polymath. He'll spin off in any direction, whatever you poke him with.
Hold me back.
So tell us, RJ, I'm not sure whether to call you James or RJ. I know.
Either way, Jim, whatever.
Yeah, I know that your given name is really a historic from your ancestors who were
Rulin James Downard. My dad was Rulin Lamont Downard.
Yes,
and they're all Mormon names, and that's that end of the family, and it always got mispronounced in school. Not only that, but my last name. So I would get Downward Rulon J, and I would say Jim. And so for years I didn't really use my first name on there and went with just James Jim, and that's how it is on the books and all that.
Yeah. Well, we all suffer from a bit of this. You'll be surprised how often I get called Richard, just because I've got two first names one is my surname. Anyway,
well, especially you get that with when people do bibliographies and they put things in the wrong order so that they get, or for that matter, one of the things that I noticed is like John Maynard Smith. You can tell a scientific illiterate who doesn't know the last name is Maynard Smith, comma John, not Smith, comma John Maynard.
Yes, that's right. There's no middle name. Yes. So, so we found out that your ancestors were Mormon, but tell us a bit more about your personal.
My dad had left the church long before I came along. He died just before I was born, so I didn't know him personally. But anyway, the story my mom always told about him was that all of his Mormon relatives were terribly depressed that he had left the church, and that his reply, you're going to go to hell, Rulon, and he'd say, "Well, I'll install a stoker, thing to shovel the coal with into the furnaces, and he'll make do." So it was a thing that the environment that I grew up in, we put up a Christmas tree every year and all that, did Easter eggs and all that, but it was totally secular. It was purely just as a thing. We never went to any churches, like the Christmas pageants or in the Christmas time. Never, ever. There was a Bible and a Book of Mormon in the house. My mother paid no attention to it whatsoever. It was there to look at if we wanted to. Mom sent all of us kids to Sunday school in due course, just so we'd be exposed to it. And if we wanted to become religious, fine. If not, I was the one that got kicked out of Sunday school.
no halo for you then.
I started asking questions about dinosaurs on Noah's Ark and all of that. And it was clearly nothing to do with any prodding of my mother. My mother was not some flaming atheist ideologue. No, this literally was a subject that never came up. But I was a big dinosaur kid. I had little dinosaur models and all of that, and I wanted to know, well, where did they fit in? And that was an unacceptable question to this poor hapless Sunday school teacher. And they said, "Mrs. Downard, please do not bring Jimmy back next week."
You mustn't ask that. But you mentioned Christmas trees and Easter eggs. Of course, they're pre-Christian anyway.
Yeah. Oh, well, and an awful lot of what we treat as the classic Christmas motifs is Victorian. And it relates to the fact that Victoria had married Prince Albert, who was German. And so all the little Christmas balls and all that crap, that was German ways of doing Christmas decorations. And that got intruded into the English and then copied over to the United States. And, and this is how cultural traditions metastasize over time. You can't stop them. And that's why the practices that you do in one century, nobody in 825 would have the faintest idea of what we do for Christmas in the 21st century. We're totally alien to them in terms of gift giving, in terms of the when you celebrate it, the kinds of things you eat and do. It would all be like Martian to them.
Yeah. So Saint Nicholas became Santa Claus, and his dress changed from green to red.
Yeah, Father Christmas over there, I understand.
Yes. Oh, what? Oh,
yes. In fact, I have a whole collection of the international Santa Clauses of the world, and I do Christmas decorations and stuff. And so you can see how the Santa Claus figure is in Holland and in Poland and various other, and it's metastasized over all different cultural frames. A lot of ones, like in Russian and Poland culture, they're dressed with white and blue and a completely different color scheme than what we're used to in the American Coca-Cola Santa Claus in the jolly red outfit and all of that.
Coca-Cola advert Santa Claus, yes. So you mentioned that these things that are culturally acceptable now might not be now, and vice versa, not understandable in the past. That brings me to the current woke tendency to disapprove of the past by destroying symbols of it, like statues, on our university campuses.
Yeah, the Taliban instinct.
Yes. Well, I don't think you can apply, as we've just been saying, you can't apply historic culture to today, or vice versa.
My actual degree is a BA in history, so that's what I'm officially accredited in. All my life and career and other things have been in other areas in that, but I have a BA in history, and I have always thought historically. See all those CDs on the stacks behind me?
Yeah, yeah.
I filed them all chronologically, not alphabetically.
A true historian.
So your Bartok ain't near Beethoven or Bach. They're in a completely different chronological framework. So I'm always mindful of how things have come to be the way they are. And the problem that you see with the woke sensibility is they're applying an absolutely lofty standard of things, perfection.
Yes.
And anybody that has any feet of clay or has human, Thomas Jefferson being a spectacular example, there's elements of hypocrisy, slaveholding, and brilliance, and literary ingenuity, and love of his books, and fine wines, and not giving the slaves their freedom because he can't afford to do that, and all of that mixed together. And the difficulty is that every one of us has limitations as a person. Every one of us has a background and a baggage that we may try to transcend over time, have things that we may regret having thought about and want to improve ourselves. And the problem that you get in with the woke sensibility is, and it's not new, if you look at the way the French Revolution functioned and the ideologues during that, if you look at the way the Russian Revolution ran, if you look at the Cultural Revolution in China, any of these and the Nazis, all of them are hyper ideological, Pecksniffian, looking at what words you use and all the other kinds of things, to where, like in the case of the Nazis, they couldn't play Schubert because he was Jewish.
Yes. And we're not single faceted, are we, either? We've all got multiple facets. So expecting us to fit into a particular box is unrealistic.
Well, and the historian in me says, first you want to understand the whole context as best you can. And then you can make judgments to where we can look at a George Washington versus a Thomas Jefferson in terms of their slaveholding, and point out the problems we have, or for that matter, Alexander Hamilton, who actually owned some slaves along the way too, that you can see that they're all doing a thing in the world in which slavery was considered perfectly normal and legal, and it remained so for long after they were gone. And
justified by the Bible as well.
They had moral qualms about it and how they dealt with all of that. For me, for example, Washington at least set up a framework for the slaves to be freed after his death in his will.
Yes.
Jefferson didn't do that. Why? Because he had all of that things he had to do. He wanted the wine collection. He had to sell off stuff and rebuy his book collection and all of that up in his little castle up there in Monticello, at his little fixer-upper plantation house up there. And presumably had a loving relationship with his wife, but was boinking Sally Hemings, which a lot of the conservative historians denied for years, but which we now know as an empirical fact from the mitochondrial DNA, looking at descendants, nope, he boinked. And so that all of those rumors were in fact verified. You have to assess all of that in looking at the man, and you can say that it was one of the flaws in Jefferson that his lifestyle meant that he couldn't take that moral leap and even free the slaves in his will because he couldn't afford it. And that's a thing that we ought to judge a little differently than we would at Thomas Jefferson or somebody or Washington that took a different stance on that. Well, that's what historians ought to do. Then you can get all the facts straight before you get on the high horse and then start complaining about stuff.
Everything has a cost, even our principles.
Yeah. Oh, and this goes back to the essence of morality. One of the little pieces that I lectured on a few years back. You've heard of Stephen Jay Gould's non-overlapping magisteria thing.
Yes.
It routinely gets dumped on from all sides of the affair. Jerry Coyne can't stand it, and religious people can't stand it because it draws this line that seems to give all the sciencey stuff and reason to the science part, and then the religion just gets like the leftovers, which are like morality and ethics. Isn't that kind of important? And I realized that what Gould had done was draw the line in the wrong spot, that he was dividing it between science and religion, where it was actually a line between decidable and undecidable propositions. And decidable propositions science deals with, because you can work out the criteria for proving it in an empirical way, and you can settle it. So we can figure out gravity and stars and all sorts of stuff. All of the ethics normative values, oughts, shoulds, are things that are intrinsically undecidable propositions. They may be true, they may have a correct answer, air quotes, but you can literally never get there by scientific reasoning. You have to use it by philosophical analysis and presupposition. And so it's a totally different worldview, totally different boundary layers, and crossing over them is dangerous. So that is where you get into that moral quandary that in all instances, all absolute moralities of hit areas, the trolley car problem is a classic example in psychological analysis, where we get into problems where our moralities are conflicting with one another and we can't make up our mind. And worse, science can wink at us and point out we have two different brain systems that make moral decisions. One's a snap judgment thing that runs through the amygdala. The other is the more contemplative frontal cortex one that takes some time. And that's why we inevitably get into moral quandaries, because these two systems can be cross-talking. And worse, neither one of which is dedicated to moral reasoning. They've been co-opted for that purpose in the course of our evolution. All of that is a thing where we can become informed about an issue, but yet understand that you can't ever get mathematical certainties out of moral, ethical, policy, progress issues, what we should do as society, what shouldn't. We have to grapple with it politically and philosophically. And I think the woke types, as like all ideologues, are ones that have a purity test, but they don't think through how you actually go about doing it. If you've seen the movie Lincoln that Steven Spielberg did just a little bit ago, there's a beautiful illustration of that in there, where Lincoln is trying to figure out how he can get the votes to get the 14th Amendment through. And he's dealing with the character in the Senate or in the House who was one of the leading abolitionists in there, and he actually had his servant, black servant, was actually his common law wife that he was sleeping. Is by modern day standards, absolutely modern liberal character, and he would not give an inch on some of the procedures that needed to be done in order to get the votes necessary and change the thing to get this thing through. And Lincoln told him, listen, what good is you knowing where your compass is pointing to if you go straight there, you go through a swamp and you never get there? That you have to figure out where your course is, but then figure out how to move through the actual landscape of the politics to get the results you want to do. And he finally got him to actually vote for the version that he did and compromise in that way to get towards where they wanted to go. And it showed Lincoln's leadership and all of that, but also an enormous amount of the political thing. I also love the movie because it reflected the idea that we would tend to cliche view abolitionists as all upright, liberal, non-racist people, when in fact, many of the people who abhorred slavery were just as racist as the people who hold slaves. They still considered blacks inferior. Abraham Lincoln had come from that background, and only over time, particularly when he interacted with people like Stephen Douglas, the other Douglas, I always get their names bungled up, abolitionist, Douglas. The one that Donald Trump bungled the thing on. But anyway, that as he interacted more with them, his own views developed, which is again bringing us back to that woke area. That where you start out may be bad or troublesome. It's where you end up and how you get there and what you do along the way that measures your character and your value to history.
Absolutely. But now, you mentioned evolutionists, which is not a term that I've heard any biologists use about themselves. Yes.
Yeah.
It's much more a term that theologists or theists use about biologists. So that's your main interest now, isn't it? Right?
I stumbled in to what has turned into my retirement project now that I'm technically retired.
Yeah.
And
so, it's like the history of biology, isn't it? Evolution.
Oh, absolutely. And in fact, one of the things that I've done not only in my Troubles in Paradise work beforehand, but also in the Rocks Were There and all of that with Jackson Wheat, is to bring up to speed on the history of things. One of the ironic problems with arguing with a lot of creationists today is they don't know the history of their own field. They have no idea what used to be the case in times. Oh, I'm full screen now. Wow.
So you can
Yes,
promote your books.
there's the books. Yes, there's the one I wrote on my own, Evolution Slam Dunk, which is on the reptile-mammal transition, which hadn't been properly analyzed. And one of your British paleontologists, Christine Janis, absolutely adored it and wrote a wonderful glowing review of it at Amazon. There's the Rocks Were There Volume 1. Jackson and I are currently working on the second volume because it grew like Topsy into this gigantic thing. This barely was printable. It was out at the upper limits of the physical copy that we could print. I had to shrink some of the font sizes down in the bibliography to squeak it in under the limit. And then up there, for those who like fiction, the Paralogues of Phileas Fogg, which is the first in a series of novels. It's riffs off of a science fiction mystery retelling of Around the World in 80 Days and sundry things. Anyway, back to...
That's interesting, because a lot of people are either in one camp or the other. They either write factual stuff or non-fiction stuff or fiction. And you've got a foot in both.
Well, yeah, and I can straddle both of them because I come from a much older era. We're used to now seeing science fiction effectively as almost para-religious magic. Because you've got like the Avengers movies, Marvel universe, these godlike superheroes and magical, vast, Joseph Campbell-esque battles between good and evil, and we have to find the 5 jewels to put on the glove, and all of this kind of thing. And it's very archetypal in that way. But it's different than the science fiction that I grew up with, which is the Isaac Asimov, Arthur C. Clarke era, where it's rational, no magic, no supernatural, and it was a counterpart. There's a fellow that dates me ridiculously, and most people I'm sure will never even be familiar with. Anthony Boucher, Boucher is how it's spelled, but it's Boucher.
French.
He straddled both worlds.
Yes.
He was a major book editor in the 1950s and 60s and a writer, and he wrote both science fiction and in mysteries. Yeah. Yes. So he would come out every year with the best science fiction stories of 1965 and the best mystery stories of 1965. Yes, and he would be straddling those divides. And I grew up on that as a kid because I tended to read anthologies rather than novels. So I didn't see the difference between that. I had always been fascinated by the Jules Verne, H.G. Wells era of Victorian science fiction, which was particularly with Wells. It's like proto Rod Serling. It's really about big picture questions. Yes. Like, is there eternal progress? Well, let me take you in my time machine to 802,701 and look at the Morlocks and the Eloi. That'll knock that out of you in a hurry. And so that level of stuff was occurring in that H.G. Wells tradition, and then on into Rod Serling in Twilight Zone, which I grew up with as a kid. That really influenced me. You can get almost everything in philosophy for life that you need out of the Twilight Zone.
Yeah, well, of course, in order to be a good science fiction writer, you've got to know a damn lot about science, haven't you?
Yeah, and I didn't have I didn't have a learning curve on that. I was already very interested in the process. In fact, to show you how my mind was warped at an early age, this would have been probably the early 1960s. We had moved to California by that time, and I was in 5th or 6th grade, I think. And one of the topics was to write a story that was set in 1985, the future. And so the kids were doing things my age, my contemporaries, were doing things like they were going surfing on the rings of Saturn and all of that, which was just no, sorry. And I was doing a story about the spread of monorail transportation systems in the 1980s. So I was very practical. And on top of that, another little thing, This is absolutely true. It's absolutely weird. When around that same period, The Man from U.N.C.L.E. came on, 1964, 65, 66. And I remember what I thought, so I'm like 12 or 13 years old, and I thought that you should have, a spy would need a really neat machine that he could have with him. And so I would play as like a spy thing in the Man from U.N.C.L.E. context. And I thought what they needed was a portable spy computer. And so it would be like a typewriter that would have a fold-up screen. I'm not making this up. This is how I envisaged it. And this would be battery powered, and it would communicate by space satellites, so that you would be able to communicate with your spy things, and you could put images up on screens and do all sorts of stuff in there. And I built the bottom part of it with little blocks to pretend that I was the keyboard, but I didn't have a way to have a fold-up screen. Now progress forward to the 1980s. The real 1980s. And a friend of mine and I did a science fiction story that was set in the 21st century, the 2020s. Again, totally true. We envisaged that the Soviet Union had broken up and was pulled apart as a bunch of independent principalities that were at each other's throat. There were a lot of international terrorism stuff that was going on, some of it state-sponsored. China had turned into kind of a mega economic power in the 21st century. And in this expedition that we were positing that was going out to Alpha Centauri, we figured that we needed a little portable computer interface. So we came up with the idea of what we called a pad that was about yay big, you could like put in a pocket, and would be a touchscreen visual interface that you could just talk to it and all that would allow you to interface with your bigger mainframe computer systems. So I've always been half in the past, half in the future.
So, ladies and gentlemen, I give you the inventor of the laptop.
Yeah, I should have patented the damn. Well, Arthur C. Clarke wanted to kick himself for not patenting the idea of geosynchronous satellites back in the 40s.
The H.G. Wells wouldn't have got very far with patenting Cavorite, though, would he?
No. That's in fact, I have in the second Fog novel that I'm writing, I have a little jab about that Cavorite matter. You know, somebody says about, well, why don't you, if you want to shield gravity, why don't you just put some paint on it? And the guy gives him a nasty look. That's absurd.
Wouldn't that be good? Yes.
Yeah.
So while we're on the subject of people with feet in both camps, Gene Roddenberry, he was par excellence at that, wasn't he? I mean, he managed to merge together human narrative, all the emotional stuff with a plausible future technology.
Yeah, and it was in some respects messianically over optimistic.
Oh yes,
and it reflected his philosophy of life. He imagined a world where science and exploration and would wash away all the political problems and all that. And to their credit, the series has evolved a lot, to the annoyance of some purists. By the time you got down to Deep Space Nine, they were recognizing sentient beings are complicated. They can have prejudices, they can have greed, they can have all of these downsides. And so by the time you got to that level of the series, that it had a much richer reflection, and you find it still in the brand new series that's on the Discovery series. That's it goes in that same area.
Yeah. Well, Roddenberry was an idealist and a moralist too, wasn't he? He wanted to promote his and at that time it looked conceivable, didn't it? Because of we were just fairly recently post World War II, where science had triumphed. On both sides, massive leaps forward had been made. Radar, nuclear.
And let's never minimize the enormous impact that Roddenberry's Star Trek world had on me and millions of people in positing a world of functionally absolute egalitarianism. Of where race, color, creed made no difference whatsoever. That there was the important point that literally the first interracial kiss on television was on Star Trek.
Yes, it was.
The fact that when Nichelle Nichols was thinking of retiring from Star Trek, Martin Luther King Jr. called her and urged her, no, do you realize what an
Yes.
important role model you are as the communications officer on a starship on national television, and stayed on to it? Because for me, I'm growing up at a time, remember, I'm steeped in the world of Rod Serling, which is, I can't say leftist, but progressive, a lover of equality and decency and all that. And then Star Trek comes along, and you see a world where all of the racial and political divisions have been done away with. And we're now in a world where we're exploring space and we're meeting aliens, and we're just running forward with it. That was an amazing step forward, including also the design of what the spaceship looked like, which they did just as a cost-saving measure, because they needed to have, they couldn't afford the damned optical shots of the ship landing all the time. So they came up with the gimmick of the transporter. And so they created a spaceship that looked unlike any spaceship that had ever been depicted in fiction. It didn't look like a rocket ship with fins. It was a completely unaerodynamic, true spaceship. And it just opened up layer on layer on layer, got canceled. It's only on 2.5 seasons, and yet kept on never going away, achieving a new generation in syndication. And then the next generation came along, and it's been here ever since, as much as part of our culture as Star Wars.
And shown and reshown and re-reshown. Yes. Well, the point I wanted to make is, because I'm a little bit older than you, is that at that time, science was in the ascendance. We had done all these fantastic things to fight wars, and it looked invincible. Science looked as though it was the potential solver of all the problems, to such an extent that if you had a product and you wanted to advertise it on TV, you got a man in a lab coat.
Oh, and this goes back even farther. That mode kicks in the 1930s era. And so if you want to see the vision of the thing that stays the case from the 1930s, 40s, 50s, 60s, is the world of tomorrow at the New York World's Fair.
Yes.
Welcome to the wonderful world of 1960. And you'll see all of the road, the highways, and everything that's all General Motors and giant glass Mies van der Rohe towers and giant airships flying along and landing. And technology could do no wrong.
Yes.
By the time we got down after World War II and into the atomic era and into the pollution issue of Rachel Carson and all the rest, and napalm in Vietnam, by the time you get to the world where Star Trek is coming on the scene, there's a lot of asterisks about all of that science world, rightly so, that we've had to grapple with in the half century since.
Yeah, I blame Rachel Carlson and her Silent Spring. She spoiled everything.
Well, she didn't spoil anything. It's that she held up a mirror to a side of the industry that needed to be looked at. And that's where, for example, the woke generation is doing a comparable task that's not all downside. There is degrees of systemic racism and prejudice and discrimination and deck stacking and redlining and things that have occurred in your culture. I'm sure you have examples of that as well. And practically every major society has their underclasses. We still see this in Hinduism with the Brahma versus untouchables and all that today. And those issues often get shunted aside in the glossy world of progress and the international bank and smartphones and all of the things that we deal with. But still, real people have lives that can be diminished by the baggage of what has happened to them. And in that respect, little asterisk, that the woke focus on that element of it is forcing us to have to think about that, and that's not a bad thing to do. Now, do we need to jump off the gangplank into a rigid extremism? No, and that's where old fart historians and potential old fart new historians, who are much younger than either one of us, have to play a part in saying, let's slow down, take a breath, look at what the facts are, find out what that feel is, and then make reasoned, measured judgments as to what policies you need to do to get like Lincoln said, where you need to go and not land in the swamp in the process of doing it.
Well, you see, the other thing is that although science has been not just steadily chipping away at mysteries, but accelerating, it's an exponential curve the way we've been discovering stuff. Although that's happening.
Pushback. Let me give a pushback on that.
Yeah, well, that's just what I'm going to do. I was saying, although that's happening, we have a counter, not a revolution, but a counter wave from people who aren't maybe so involved in science, who now discredit any sort of expert because they are experts, and you can't rely on experts.
Well, yeah, one YouTuber calls them experts.
The pendulum has swung too far.
Yeah. Well, this is inevitably the case. I coined the word tortugan, which is from the Latin for turtle, to describe the kinds of minds I'm encountering in the creationism movement and in other areas. There are people who have hunkered down underneath an impenetrable mind shell. Contrary information just bounces right off. You find this in any major political ideology. You find this among dogmatists of all stripes. I admit tortugan atheists as well as fundamentalist Christians and all of that. And that is the phenomenon that in some respects we're bumping into with an awful lot of the ideologues who get into that area. I think if you would find the most annoying people, look at the anti-vaxxer movement. It's a characteristic here. The ones that have been screaming bloody murder about COVID and passing disinformation, it turns out only about a dozen people are involved in the core data field dissemination. And they cluster, in fact, in even smaller, because some of them are like husband and wife and they're associates of one another. So you've only got about like 10 nodes of information that provide 65% of all of the claptrap on the internet about this. That just gets copied and copied and copied. So that you have to pay attention to. But I wanted to give a teeny bit of a pushback about the idea of how much change there's been. You know, the generation that underwent the greatest change one of the greatest changes of all time is the generation that lived from 1870 to 1925. They saw a world that went from horse and buggies, telegraphs, and that's it, to a world of airplanes, radio, potential television, gas warfare, women smoking in public, short skirts, Dadaist poetry, relativity theory, and automobiles and phonographs and motion pictures, an entire worldview shift into an entirely new thing. Whereas we still live in that same world. We have a smartphone. Okay, that's just a portable version of the television set that can communicate by radio waves. Somebody in 1925 would have understood that if you'd explained it to them. It's just more sophisticated. We have rocket ships. Jules Verne could describe those. So we live in a world that's just an extrapolation of the world that existed before, but it's not a gigantic gear shift in the way that was in that generation.
Well, I don't know that I can agree with you wholeheartedly there. And you missed out atonal music for the generation before 1925.
That too. Atonal, Arnold Schoenberg, that's all part of expressionism. It was sort of applying the same breakdown point that was occurring in the physics world and in the science world to the arts.
But I want to question some of your premises there, because many years ago I was watching the moon landing on a small black and white TV set, and it was live, of course, if you remember, in those days. And I was watching it with my grandfather, who died just a couple of years later. But he looked at me and he said, "Do you think they'll ever get there?" He thought he was watching a movie.
Oh, and my grandmother was the same way. But remember, that was the generation. My grandmother was born in the 1880s. And so she lived in that generation that went through the great gear shift, and she could not catch up. There are an awful lot of people that went through that time frame. You look at, I can't remember the name of it. He was a physicist who was from the older generation, and his son had died during World War I, and so he had got into spiritualism. He was one of those who just ballistic over relativity theory. The name is escaping at the moment. Anyway, he was calling them the Bolsheviki of science, and this was, of course, during the time of the Russian Revolution and all of that.
Yes, yes.
That generation often had a really tough time of it. My mom understood. She was born in 1910 and grew up in the newer period. She had much less difficulty, and she was always kind of a techno geek. And her husband, my dad, was a ham radio person. Had he lived, would have been the first on the block to have the color television set and the first one to use the internet and all that. He was just the techno geek of that type. And that spirit of adventure, of always looking into the new, the only thing that restricted my capacity to buy the advanced technology was money. So I had to wait until the VCR got down to the right level, and I had to wait till the high definition TV got cheap enough to buy that kind of thing. But and there's always the danger. You don't want to be the early adopter and get stuck with the beta versus the VHS.
Yes. There is that. Yes. So I promised our viewers that we would do some talk about evolution. So we better get on to that. Otherwise, we're going to annoy them. So what I'm going to do, with your permission, is play a very short video that I made, and I'm going to ask you to comment on it.
Have it.
Right, here we go.
I'm not.
There you go.
Yeah, you have dived headlong into two absolutely delicious issues. One is the systematics issue, and the other is the thing that I overall put in as map of time. and I'll deal with the systematic issue first.
Okay. Mm.
Horrible shock. The issue that you're bringing up is not restricted to science.
No.
Exactly the same problem comes in any attempt to systematize things that are
Yes.
complicated and layered.
Yes.
That, for the example that I bring up in, I think it's in the Roxford there, I even allude to it, is the movie The Great Race from 1965 a musical or not? What is it? Is it a comedy? Is it a historical epic? It's got musical numbers in it. Is it a musical? Somebody that sings with just an orchestral accompaniment. She sings the Sweetheart Tree. So isn't that a musical? It's not a lot of musical. How do you classify that? What do you do? And in any attempt to deal with categorizations, the things way back over, part of that here and then part of that over there are my DVD and Blu-ray stuff, the video stuff. There's always going to be a thing that falls through the cracks in systematic evaluation. And you get into hissy fits. Look at the fist fights people can get into as to whether or not a hot dog or a taco should qualify as a sandwich.
Yes. Or what are those orange things called? Whether it's a Jaffa cake. Is it a cake or a biscuit?
Exactly, yeah, or is it tomato, a fruit, or a vegetable? And it depends on how you define it. It depends on what characters you deal with. Now, getting into the evolutionary systematic issue, because species, as Darwin recognized, are kind of temporary things that are not absolutely fixed. And remember, the reigning paradigm prior to Darwin was species fixity. And it was really an annoying thing to people. That species, that the thing that you see where the chickens always look like chickens, and Kent Hovind would say, dogs always living like a dog. That was an idea began to break down as, first of all, naturalists began studying more stuff, and then particularly when they found out how many species there were. That it's unnerving. In the Bible, for example, only mentions like a few hundred animals, and they were all the familiar ones you would know from where the big birds and locusts and cattle and all that stuff. They're familiar barnyard animals and other critters. The age of exploration went out, and they by the time you hit that science geeky 18th century, they would bring naturalists with them in part to see what exploitable resources there would be in the future colony, all of that. But the thing is that the number of species count went up ballistically to where, okay, we've got the calculations, we make the list of 1,000 species, okay, 5,000 species, okay, 10,000 species, okay, 50,000 species, okay, 100,000 species, okay, 200,000. And literally you couldn't keep up. The entire,
of course,
the 18th and 19th century was just a glut of nitpicky as they're trying to write down what they were and figure out what's what. And when you started seeing things at that level, and Darwin was the science geek who was trying to do the internet before the internet, physically writing letters to people and getting them to send things back. Tell me about this. Ooh, I see this paper. Tell me more about that. And that he would realize, and from his own observations going around on the Beagle, it's no coincidence that the two people who came up independently with natural selection evolution, Alfred Wallace and Darwin, were not bound to museums. They weren't like Cuvier or Owen sitting there at their desk having a platypus Hulk brought to them. No, they were out in the wild seeing the organisms in a natural environment, in a geological context, with what fossils that you could see in the area and all of that. And suddenly, things look much less tidy than it would from the laboratory. And so probably the area that really went into high gear because of Darwin, and the reason why Asa Gray, the botanist, became an early Darwin guy, is because plant systematics was a mess. It was just a catalog of the features and they had names to them. They had little names, but it was just a mess. It meant nothing. Darwin suddenly comes along, and like Beethoven picking up music and turning it into romanticism, suddenly plants make sense. They're characters in a lineage, and that transformed that discipline probably even earlier than what we see in the paleontological area, where there was a lot of non-Darwinian scientists still clunking along even into the 1890s and later.
Well, that's interesting because my first degree was in biology, in botany, in fact. And back in those days, we only had morphology and a bit of anatomy to classify things with. And of course, humans love to classify. We can only study things.
Can't help it.
In our boxes. Yes.
Paranoia. It looks like a face to me. It's got to be a face.
Yeah. And a friend of mine went off and studied garden plants and came up with a huge 4-edition flora with one of these academic books, which each edition costs £100 or whatever. And of course, in the meantime, since he finished and retired, in the meantime, we've gone over to using cladistics and
genetics.
We are DNAing everything. And
all within our lifetimes.
Yes. And so
you and I are from a time where we can remember when they didn't know what genes a plant had.
Yes. So all of that lifetime work based on morphology with a bit of anatomy is redundant.
Yeah. In fact, there's a bunch of benchmarks, not only in botany, but in various other areas where you have to keep a mental map of time thing in there as to, if it's a book from that period, bear in mind, that's the ancient days. Don't take it as gospel. So in any thing relating to biology is not merely after the 1950s. It really, anything before the 1990s has to be taken with grains of salt, because it was only then that they were discovering homeobox genes that are the regulator master switches that are the reason why phyla look the way they do and all of that stuff. Geology, anything before the plate tectonic revolution in the 1970s has to be treated with a grain of salt. They're perfectly valid work, but they were missing too much of the field to be able to make sense of it in the way that we do now.
But it's not just in the field of science either, is it? I mean, I was a minor politician between the years 94 and 2003. And I did a lot of stuff. I got some headlines in the newspaper, front pages in the local rag and so on. But you can't see it now because the internet hadn't got going.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, and that's an amazing thing about the technologies that we have available. And it's a double-edged sword because it allows woo to spread and metastasize. In the old days, some wackaloon crank would go down to Hyde Park, get on their little box, and they still do that today, apparently, and they would be ranting about such and so, and that would be it. Nowadays, it can be live streamed, or they do the rant from their basement with the thing, and it's seen everywhere in the world. I was just discussing on the piece that was done about Tom Paine and about the issues of how the kinds of things that were being done in a written format in those days are now done instantaneously. And you create a work that in the old days, you might have some sense of who was seeing it because you were getting feedback from letters and fan mail and all of that. But now if you put a YouTube on video and it's seen by 1 million people, how do you know what kind of people are the ones watching it and what are they taking out of it unless they put a comment in? So it alters the dynamics of it. It's a new thing that we have to get used to doing. At ground, it all turns on exactly the same methodology issues that Socrates faced, and the people who are saying, this writing thing is going to make terrible effects because nobody has to memorize anything anymore. It's going to just lead to hell in a handbasket. Well, we figured out how to compensate for that, but it's a radically interesting new tool that we have, and we're using it, and we got to master it. We can't let it run us.
And like writing, nothing is ever forgotten. If you've said something once, it's there forever. So a lot of people who made silly racist comments when they were teenagers.
You're there, Richard Dawkins.
There you go. There's an example.
Yeah, it becomes immortal, and that actually does the flip side of the issue, which again brings us back to that speciation issue that was in the video. It's that one of the gigantic. See, I study creationism and anti-evolutionism at the source methods level. It's my big bugbear. The point is not too many of the analysts look at it just from theology. They think God did it, therefore everything follows from that. Well, that's partly true, but how can they do the follow from it part? That's where, when you look at what sources they rely on and what they don't, how they parse information and how they don't, now you're looking up, you open the hood, and you're looking at all the nuts and bolts, forgetting about what's just spewing out the back end. And what we get at, one of the pathological mental blocks of anti-evolutionists is they just can't conceptualize speciation. Period. That they think that a species is a fixed blob or a kind, and that they can't, even if they accept the idea that speciation can happen, they just can't apply that. Well, was it going on here? Was it going on there? Let's look at that fossil. What was happening there? And so there's this penumbra of change that's implied by speciation that literally no anti-evolutionist can be caught thinking about. Literally.
No. Well, that's precisely why I made that video and likened it to a train going through a station. Yeah. So another analogy
that's available that I think is a clear one. There's various versions of it, but you have a line of text that runs down the page, and it's usually about a paragraph. And it starts out like blue ink, and it ends up red. And at no point has it turned from blue to red, and yet it ends up blue to red. That's a conceptual bit of what is going on, even with punctuated equilibrium and these other processes. That and the other thing that they can't get a grip on is populations. They think of an individual animal, like sexual reproduction. They have to imagine that some little amoeba suddenly develops genitalia, and it has to wait around for the other amoeba to develop a vagina so it can have sex. And if that can't happen, well, you can't have evolution. And you're going, no, that's not how this works. No, you have a problem here, Ed.
Well, on the subject of first man and first woman, I like to point them to poodles. You know, we've bred poodles, but there was never a first male poodle and a first female poodle. There were just ancestors that were a bit less poodly and descendants that were a bit more poodly.
Well, that's why Darwin was so obsessed with pigeons. It was exactly the same thing. In the time when he was studying of pigeon breeding, they had literally forgotten where the original pigeons had come from. That it was, even though it was not that far back in time, they were so busy breeding things with puffy things and that they lost track of it. And even to this day, they're still doing genetic studies and that to work out just exactly what natural pigeons were the progenitors of all the ones that the pigeon breeders were playing around with.
We've got an actual question here, which is about luck. What do you think about luck?
Or the fancy word stochastic. Yeah, that's the somebody that really thought a lot about this was Stephen Jay Gould. And if you want to dive into that, just plow into his views. He would get into knockdown dragouts in the bad old days between him and Richard Dawkins and John Maynard Smith and all of the others over the idea of whether everything was adaptive or not. He thought not. And that there was a degree of chance that it's the Wonderful Life book that he wrote on the Cambrian explosion in, I think, 87, somewhere around in there, ancient times. There's some quibbles because there's been more paleontology since, but the overall thing of it is very important. The issue of, if you reran the tape of life, if you wound it back before the Cambrian and let the thing play out again, would it have arrived at the same critters that we see now? How much of that was chancy, stochastic, not necessarily adaptive? And it's still an issue that's being grappled with by paleontologists and developmental biologists in this area. How much of it was inevitable? You have Simon Conway Morris, who's a Christian theistic evolutionist. He would take the position that an awful lot of things, especially multicellularity, was inevitable, that it's going to happen one way or another in some form or another. I'm oddly, from a theistic non-believer perspective, I have a lot of favoring about that aspect of things. At the same time, I also can reflect the issues about how much goes on stochastically. And here's where you can look at the giant speed bumps of life. And if the Cambrian, which we have a lot of paleontological data, but not nearly enough to settle the issue. And for the Cambrian, to those who are not geology geeks, it's about 500 million years ago. And this was where we now definitely see most, if not all, of the animal phyla actually physically represented in the fossil record. Our chordates were little itty bitty wiggly things about yay big, Kaya and Cathymeris and all of that, only about an inch long or so. That if you saw one in the river, you'd go away. And that group eventually turns into all the vertebrates we know and love, including us and whales and kangaroos and shrews and all the rest of the stuff. How inevitable was that? The fact that we had so many phyla that had their thing on the stage for a long time and then fizzled out, trilobites being a spectacular example, which brings up, in fact, Jackson and I have talked about this, my co-author on Rockster there, my suspicion is, and he is not averse to it as well, is that those billions of years that were boring before the Cambrian explosion, that were just, non-big things, they were, you've got some cyanobacteria and the origin of eukaryotic cells, well, hell, who's that? What's that? That boring part probably was way less boring than we can see because they don't leave fossils. And that there may have been lineages. One of the reasons I suspect, you know about the endosymbiotic idea, that you have definitely in the case of chloroplasts in plants, those are cyanobacteria that have been amalgamated in, and there's multiple tertiary endosymbiosis and all that. Creationists hate that, by the way.
There was a woman whose name I can't remember who came up with that idea.
Lynn Margulis, ex Mrs. Carl Sagan. Well, she didn't come up with it. She certainly popularized it.
Yes, there was an earlier woman who came up with that idea. Yeah.
Very few people, very little is invented on the spot. There's a lineage to everything. But anyway, she helped popularize it. Anyway,
I'm speaking to the inventor of the laptop, so you're right.
Mitochondria are in all of animal cells and plants and all over the place, and they are believed to have predated this cyanobacteria thing. So that's an additional one that's occurring only in plants, because plants also have mitochondria. What's the mitochondria? And to this day, there's a big tussle about which group of basal bacteria are the more likely ones for the mitochondria. And I think it's because the group that mitochondria came from is now extinct. We just don't think about the idea that a major lineage of life forms in a pre-Metazoan sense could have strutted on their stage and had billions of years and then finally died out, leaving only one descendant that got amalgamated as the mitochondria in eukaryotes. And that's my suspicion. I can't prove it or disprove it because they don't leave fossils. But it would explain why there's such a difficulty in isolating the mitochondria in a way that they haven't had the problem with cyanobacteria and chloroplasts in plants.
And this is really the problem with trying to apply backwards thinking to origins, where an origin might have been a leuca, which then became a multi-branched tree. Tree's not a good analogy, but let's say tree.
Well, the shrub. And of course, anti-evolutionists go just ape shit over that because they go, see, lateral gene transfer, that eliminates the tree of life. Well, it makes bacterial systematics much murkier because they can exchange genetic information, and therefore makes phylogenies much more difficult to deal with from them. But it doesn't make the reptile-mammal transition go away billions of years later, kids. Cell speciation and organ specialization is just another expression of the layers of the substrate. In a sense, although what we've got is that, again, that idea of contingency. Stephen Jay Gould, again, is a go-to. I grew up with Stephen Jay Gould writing, not Richard Dawkins. And I only bumped into Richard Dawkins as a consequence of the fact that he's the lightning rod for anti-evolutionists and criticisms of atheism. And so they go after him. And so I began to study him that way. But Gould made a great deal about the idea of contingency. And one of the examples he brought up are sweat glands. That everybody everywhere is born with the same number of sweat glands. But how many of them get active depends on the temperature range that they encounter by around 5 years old. So and this would come up from old Brits, who would go down entourage to the tropics there, and they would be sweating like nobody's business there in the humid heat there. But their little children that were born in Calcutta had no problem with it. Why? Because their sweat glands opened up in a different dynamic. Another one that would be is language. There is a giant map of vowels and consonants that occur, and over time, largely on the language that you hear from your mother, starts mapping you onto things, and so those start blobbing in. Yeah. And that's in the Japanese mode. R's and L's lump together. And then you've got I think Swedish is the one that has more vowels than any. They got more little blobs of vowels than any. All those one with the lines through them and the little umlauts and all that. Yeah, right. And that gets locked in. That's contingent. Nothing in your brain is determined by it's what you are experiencing. So there's inheritance. There is experience, which is that Lamarckian side of what you encounter. And we know also that your genetics can be affected by, for example, starvation. There were people that were Dutch that went through a privation during World War II, and their children have a different biology in relation to proteins and things because of that experience that their parents had, and its epigenetic connections and all that. But in between is contingency. And so you got things that have to occur at a particular time or a particular context. If you don't learn language by a particular time, you're screwed. Yes. And so those are the multiple layers. Gould didn't like simplistic things. He loved to see the layer and layer and layer of interacting. And so everybody in biology, in politics, in economics, and the universe probably has to think about multiple stuff all the time. My co-author Jackson came up with a wonderful word, monocausism. The obsession with, here's the cause for this. No, that's not how it works.
Well, one thing that study of biology soon teaches you is not to be dogmatic, because if you make any statement about something biological, tomorrow you're going to find an exception.
Yeah. Well, and because nature is squishy. Yes. Or better yet, it's non-linear. And this is where one of my other interests, for a while I was a math major. I was insane. A math major and history major, double for a while. And I got up to higher level matrices, I think in my first year or so, and I realized, no, my brain was not going to do this. No, I had to junk that. But I did get an awful lot of familiarity with an awful lot of range of mathematics. And since then, one of the points that I think Stephen Jay Gould wouldn't have had a problem with is the idea that there's a non-linearity to biology. Linearity, everybody knows what a linear system is. It's your car. You turn the car on and you put your foot down on the accelerator and you go faster, and you pull it back and it goes slower, and you put your foot on the brake and it slows down. You turn the radio on and you turn the volume up or down, and you have your heater that you can turn up and down. These are all linear systems. A thing does a thing. Nonlinear systems are horrifying to deal with. Weather is a nonlinear system. I think economics is a nonlinear system. Yeah. And it's as if when you turn the radio on, it changed the function of the speedometer and it altered how the brake worked. Yes. And when you press on the brake, it changed the volume on the radio to another and switched it to another channel. Yes. You have things that connect up with stuff. Trying to model that, there is a mathematics that you can do with that, but there's a mathematics that therefore means that you don't have control anymore. That there's a degree of unpredictability to it.
And you need big data sets to get anywhere near a decent
And even if you do, it doesn't help you necessarily. No. I had a knockdown drag out with my very religious niece's husband, who was very seen in Back to the Future 2, where the weather control, the rain starts and stops, it's all on schedule, they can control the weather. And I was saying, nope, can't do that. No matter how many weather stations you have, no matter how accurate they are, you're going to reach a level of uncertainty because weather is a nonlinear system. And he just couldn't wrap his head around that. And here's why. You have a station, and by definition, an instrument has a finite range of accuracy. There's a point at which it's not absolutely accurate out to forever decimal places. There is a point at which you drop it off. Let's say you have a really accurate instrument and it's like out to 1,000 decimal places. The fact that you can only go to 1,000 decimal places means you've lost control because it's a nonlinear system. You would have to have absolute knowledge of the system, not out to 1,000 decimal places. And so anything that has a nonlinear quality to it, it's not that you can't see patterns to it. Pretty much the odds of it snowing on my driveway in Spokane in August is really low, but not impossible.
Yes, indeed. Yes. There's no absoluteness, is there? And that of course, meteorologists get really annoyed when they hear people say that the weather is unpredictable. It's not unpredictable. It's just uncertain.
Yeah. There's a structure to it that allows you to be probabilistic. And here, which brings up the other terrible thing that just drives people nuts and gets them into think is quantum theory and the uncertainty principles that are underlying physics. It just bothers some people. And bothered Einstein, for that matter. Einstein just didn't like the idea at all. Well, sorry, Albert, you were wrong. The universe is stochastic. It's probabilistic at that level, whether you like it or not.
Yes. I'm so glad I live in a macro world.
Yeah, well, and that's the interesting issue, is that we live in a world that's far from the micro quantum world, and we don't really interact with the relativistic world that's on a cosmic scale much. So we live in this little window. We live in a window where we're looking at just a range of acoustic waves and a range of electromagnetic radiation. But even at that, we're limited. Birds and bugs can see into the ultraviolet, the infrared, and all of that. Although some human beings occasionally can see, the range can vary because every organism has natural variations.
Yes. And that's what makes medicine so difficult, isn't it? Because
absolutely.
We're trying to treat an individual, and all we know about is a population.
Or worse, they built it like genetic analyses. They have the human genome. No, they have a genome from an individual human.
Yes.
And then the other issue is, look at the number of medical work that were done on men, not women or children. So they're then extrapolating the medicine criteria to kids who have different biologies that haven't developed completely, and then women that have a slightly different hormone biology that can change things radically. And what could go wrong?
Yeah, everything. Yes. Well,
exactly.
Listen. You've exhausted me.
Did I get some useful comments on your video?
Oh yes, certainly. Yeah. You broadly, we are in agreement, aren't we? Let's face it. We're trying to educate people who don't understand what the reality is like.
Yeah.
And in that sense, we're kindred spirits.
And we both agree, yes, that we have absolutely no excuse in the 21st century not to be able to know this stuff. It's too easily available. Nobody has an excuse for stupidity and ignorance.
No, the only reason that you don't know things like that is willful ignorance.
Is your hand all cramped up and you can't use the mouse to click on that link and find out the original paper? No, I'm afraid you can do that.
Yeah. Well,
if you can link on Alex Jones, you can link on the proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences.
Well, I'll make a small excuse, because some people are not very good at coming up with search strings.
Yes, that's a skill that is a scholarly methods person I know entirely well. Is that if you go into Google, for one thing, for example, if you're looking at, this pops up in creationism all the time. If you want to find out about polystrate fossils, you put in polystrate fossils, and what do you get? Are a pile of creationists, because geologists don't use that term.
No.
So they are skewing the terminology to get the search engine to land where they want. Political ideologues do exactly the same thing in using buzzwords. One way around it is to end run. For one thing, you want to locate things to find out where the context of the topic is. Once you start finding out what's stratified and paleo soils and all these other issues come up, then you can start finding where the context of it is and find out what the terminology is in the real science and bypass the stuff on there. Another clue is that when you see a paper referred to, try at some point Googling, if it's a not too long paper, the whole title of the thing. And or if it's a very long one, a segment of it that's very specific, and that can help you locate it when it might not come up on the first or second try on the regular searches.
Indeed.
Tricks you do.
But as I said, it's nearly my bedtime. And you've been fantastic, as I knew you would. And so thank you very much for coming on the show.
Thank you for inviting me. Thanks, StreamYard, for the connection holding good.
It worked well, didn't it? Yes.
Well, yeah, boy. The non-gods have smiled on us. The StreamYard gods have. Yes. I was right to make that human sacrifice to the StreamYard god before I went online.
So that's what you did, is it?
Yeah. I have a constant supply of like freeze-dried stuff that comes in, from Amazon. So I always have a thing down in the basement that I can use for a sacrifice.
The blood. Yes.
Yes, indeed. Yes.
Okay,
so a little Stonehenge model that I can use for all that out in the solstice.
No. So let's hope it works again, and maybe we can do this another time.
Yeah. There's certainly enough to talk about. We barely dived into a lot of the issues about woke and the philosophical challenges that we're facing. You were able to see the live chat more than I have. How were they reacting?
Yeah, we've got a lot of comments here that I haven't put up. I can just put in a few here, but Facebook user tells me not to post his things because he doesn't want, he's supposed to be working or something. He doesn't want people to know he's online.
Interdisciplinary. But that one goes back all the ways. I'm one of those, again, that is familiar with C.P. Snow's Two Cultures and a Second Look. It was a big thing, and it's still available, from like 1960, where he was chastising the scientists of the period for not really thinking that the arts were important at all. They were just all going Monsanto and technology. And the artists who thought, well, they don't really need to know about the science stuff. When you go back to the Romantic era in the 1830s and 40s, they straddled those lines. Goethe loved the sciences just as much as the arts. And you found the art-loving science geeks like Napoleon who loved both fields of that. And so the idea that this has never been happened before, that this divide is somehow inevitable, no.
Long live the polymath. So I'm going to announce that next week we have a pastafarian. I don't know whether he calls himself a preacher. No, maybe a pastor. I don't know. He's a leader of a pastafarian church.
He better have a colander and an eye patch.
He's not a million miles away from you because you're just south of the Canada border. And he's just north of it in...
you'll have to ask him whether or not he's a Bowtie-arian or a Linguinian. I mean, we got to get specific here for the doctrines.
All I know is that he's in British Columbia.
That's directly north of us in Washington.
Indeed, yes. So, thank you very much. I'm going to let you go now. And I've announced next week, or the week after, it's the guy who had to pull out tonight. I announced last week that we had the bearded heretic today. And unfortunately, he had a family event come up, and he had to pull out and attend his mum's birthday because COVID has made it possible in where they live.
John, you had to dragoon me into this a week early.
Well, yes, you were scheduled for 2 weeks' time, and you kindly came early, and we've had a great discussion tonight. So the person who moved on is the bearded heretic, and he will be the week after next, and so on and so forth. So what have we got?
Beat goes on.
Yeah. Helps when I can limit the date or the URL I'm searching.
Any variable can help, and always remember to keep your eye open, because you may discover something in the search you weren't looking for, but is actually more interesting than the thing you were looking for.
Well, that's right. When you're trying to search for a sentence, and you find a word in it that's key, and you go to the dictionary, very often you find a rat's nest of other words that you need to define.
Well, and even it's the equivalent in a way of the library. It's an analog to that, because anybody who's done research in old physical libraries would go to the stacks to find the book, and there's other books next to it, and you go, kind of interesting. I didn't know about that one. You can do something that's a counterpart of that on there. So keep your eyes open. Don't try to be tunnel visiony. Sometimes it gets very time consuming because there's a rabbit hole there and another rabbit hole there. But if you remember what's of value to you, you want to broaden your understanding of things.
Yes.
You want to, especially if there's something that you didn't even realize you didn't know, but you should. That's the most important stuff.
Yeah. So try and focus on your way down the layers of the onion. Absolutely. RJ, thank you very much. Maybe we'll chat for a few minutes after I've stopped live streaming. Bye-bye.
Bye. To everybody.